Need it, and we're good to go.
And then you can just move you can move it to that screen and then, yep.
You good?
Okay.
Hi everyone. I hope you had an enjoyable lunch. And let's get started with the afternoon session.
Of this thing here. Yeah.
I'm Yasu from Emory University. I'm chairing the modeling analysis for air quality application session. Our first speaker is Greg Carmichael and Pius Lee. And they will talk about the air quality reanalysis.
Okay, thank you. As you mentioned, we're going to talk about air quality reanalysis. The Tiger team, science team for this is listed here. We have quite a broad group of people who are contributing to this. So what I'm going to do is take just the first 2 to 3 minutes to set the stage for the big picture of what we're trying to do. We've actually gotten pretty far along in terms of producing or standing up this reanalysis system and that I'll describe to you. Then Pius will take over and tell you where we're at in terms of moving forward in actually implementing this and getting our first products out. So our ACAS product for the reanalysis is shown here, and what we're talking about is there's a big need for being able to predict the 3-dimensional or 4-dimensional distribution of air pollutants. We're talking about the continental U.S. scale at this particular point for many, many applications. But there's big challenges in running forward air quality prediction systems. One comes from the need for getting the weather right, but from an air quality perspective, we have added problems such as emissions that we have to deal with. And so you look at the current status of air quality prediction, and more forecasting activities are occurring. Most of these models at the regional scale are running unconstrained. We're beginning to put in some operational capabilities for assimilation. At the global scale, we're much farther along in terms of assimilation of products such as for ozone and for some aerosol assimilations. So this particular product is looking at how we can improve by combining observations and models in an optimal sense of producing these 4-dimensional data sets as a reanalysis would imply, not as a forecast, but actually as a optimal in kind of a historical context where we have that data set that can be used for the whole variety of applications that we have on the far right there. So all sorts of air quality assessments, for example, state implementation plans. And one of our first applications is actually, is going to be with Maryland in terms of helping them with their SIP analysis, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But there's also needs for rapid deployment of a variety of different assessments, new fuel types, etc. The health domain is really critical. They rely on PM 2.5 or PM 10 surface-based either observations or models to do their health disease relationship, or systematically things like global burden of disease, and so that data set is needed for that. In addition, when we have this kind of analysis and reanalysis system, it also provides us a long-standing bed where we can actually demonstrate the improvements when we bring a new asset, a new observational asset or system online. What is its impact on the predictability or the constraint of the system? And so the analysis system will give us that. And it also is a great way to bring and ingest in what this kind of serviced operations in this kind of operational settings that we're standing up, the new products that relate to operations. So as we improve the soil emissions, or as we improve tools that can combine different combinations of retrievals of satellites to get better PAR or better photosynthetic estimates. And so all of those tools can find their way into this ultimately into this reanalysis system. And so, again, the analogy we're taking is this reanalysis following from meteorology. And so if you think about why doing a reanalysis, historically from the weather perspective, we can do an analysis. If we're doing forecasting every day, our best estimate, we can put together the latest or the first 6-hour forecast, piece those all together every 6 hours, piece it together for as long as we're running that model forward. We have an analysis state. But if you think about that, the model, if we do that over many years, the model's going to change, the observing system's going to change, And it's really, you can't from that analysis state derive any trends. You can't really say anything about whether the weather systems change from that analysis state, what's due to the models, what's due to the observations. And so they do this reanalysis where you're able to then use a single model setting, and then you're able to bring in more of the observations, more of the QA observations, and then run that system forward in time. And now you have at least a consistent test bed where you can systematically measure the improvements that are coming from either the model improvement or the observational system as it's evolving in time. So there's lots of lessons that we're trying to carry over from an air quality perspective. The application reanalysis areas, as I mentioned, the first one we're going to stand up is the SIP for Maryland, and the second one we're going to do in this first year cycle is related to health, and that's Yang is leading that activity here. And in the interest of time, if you look at what we're currently able to do, we either have to do it from observations. If you're going to do the analysis, you have to wait till all the data set is in, a year time lag. If you're going to do it based on forward modeling from the EPA, you wait till the emissions inventory has been updated. That's a 3-year lag. And so you can't do this in a very quick way, nor in a very consistent way over time, and that's one of the things we hope to demonstrate. And this is very much a service to product mindset that we're going for, and so we want to stand up this reanalysis from an air quality, first from ozone and PM 2.5 perspective, and have it available to the public just like the meteorological reanalysis is, and those reanalyses are used many, many, many different ways. So with that, I'll turn it over, and Pius will tell you more about what we're really doing at this point in terms of realizing this reanalysis.
Thank you, Greg. I think so much is covered. I don't have much to say to add. But to continue elaborate on what has been done and what will be done in the next cycle, or next cycle that I try to elaborate. This is a single model setting Greg had alluded to. We try to find something where we can have a consistent test bed, a long term, and go back, for example, what was the first deliverable is 2011 case for SIP modeling for Maryland Department of Environment. And then the second is the health application. So we try to start from a special case in 2011 and go back to 2010. The HTAP, somebody, I think David mentioned, the 2010 is a good year, and that we'll commit to do again, and that suite will have this consistent single model setting to do all those multi-year model runs, maybe 6 hourly, and then piece them together. But the talk I will be continuing today is to evaluate our model, a single model setting. So this is starting from a WRF, meteorological driver, and MSIP is a one-way feedback. So go down to from MSIP, it will feed to CMAQ. The CMAQ version is 471, and the key have several places called CGRID. Actually, that might not be the most important difference between the National Air Quality Forecasting Capability and the National Weather Service, which is NAMB. The main difference between the National Forecast System and this is reanalysis project single model setting is the LCC. The forecasting system has a different projection, and every hour the meteorologists need to be interpolated into the LCC number conformal conic projection. But with this analysis system, we have one single system, so we do not need to do that projection. So it's consistent, and we hope to have this upper right corner have a LBC from GFS, and we also restructure our vertical layering that match the GFS, so we can bring in those observation data more accurately. So, and this is when I allude to a National Air Quality Forecasting System. So we try to have similar physics and chemistry package between the two, so we can compare side by side and have the lessons learned. What we do daily, multi-cycle data in the forecasting system can be the knowledge can strengthen and really reinforce our understanding on the reanalysis project as we go forth. So on the physics package, we try to match like the PBL scheme, radiation scheme. So we try to have that exactly like the NEQFC, the forecast system in NWS. Difference mentioned a while ago, we have tighter vertical structure, so we can bring in, a while ago we mentioned about strict intrusion, wildfire, those, we try to bring in those more accurately with tighter vertical structure. And this is a major decision we made during this few months. The team met several times, and we have decided to match the GFS 42 layers up to about 50 millibar. The tightening structure, more tight vertical structure is along the PBL, the top of the PBL surface layers, and around the total pulse, where the e-folding occurs. And this this is the period we commit to deliver to Maryland Department of Environment, July 2011. This is the situation, the same period Discovery Q first campaign took place. And then we have some current 3D data to check our reanalysis project. And this is the current shown on the top panel is really from the NEQFC setting of the 20 layers. So it's not as good. We try to beat this performance by quite a big margin with our analysis product. And this is the comparison between the cross-section, what is done during the post-analysis using NEQFC, and on the right is the reanalysis model setup, all the way go up to 50 millibars with structure, 42 layers, tighter, as I mentioned, 3 places. So we capture those most dynamically variant places in the vertical. And we saw this worth noting is there's no really, this cross cut along Denver, a very complex terrain, longitudinal cross section. And we see it's reasonable to capture, and there's no spurious high accumulation of vertical concentrations. And then after that, we will go to check different verification phase of the product. And we see the 42 layers really do better with, this is ozone, doing better with this AR max data, which is the standard daily for EPA daily criteria. So we just see the 42 layers really doing slightly better. Although we just have this no data simulation, just changing the vertical structure. And the same thing for PM. We see it might be not more obvious than the ozone performance, but in some places of the corners it does better. And we have statistical numbers to strengthen it. And this is now what to be done in the next phase of our task. We have already tested the data simulation scheme to take in MODIS AOD that will constrain the PM loading along the vertical atmospheric column, and that is done, but we need to invoke it and execute that. The second part is the AirNow surface monitor will bring observations, hourly data. For reanalysis, we have more QA data product than AirNow called AQS, Air Quality System from the EPA. So we have those two is right on the next to-do items on our list. And then further down in the list, the two, we will, the Alabama University group had helped us to modulate the photolytic rate using cellular observed cloud locations and characteristics. And later on, Dan Cohen will help us with satellite-assisted confirmation the emission rate for biogenic emissions. And in summary, we have several things achieved so far as the project kick-started a few months ago. We decided on an important single model setting they're consistent. We've been tests in 2010 on. The setting is satisfactory so far, and we need to piece in those data ingest pieces with the data set. It can be challenging. Some are column, 2D, then we need to redistribute back into the which column, whether it's to the PPL height or to in the column. We have data that is twice daily or their data hourly, so we are working on those with GSI as our protocol. And later on, we will, run 2010 as the last item. We will take questions.
Actually, we've had a request that the speakers repeat the questions when someone asks a question. So if you could just briefly summarize the question for the people tuning in through the broadcast.
Okay.
Okay. I assume when you do the model performance, you're looking at ground level monitors or receptors. Have you looked at how it performs based on measured ozone values aloft, such as about 850 millimoles?
Yes, that's exactly why we chose. Oh, okay. The question was when we verify the performance of analysis single model setting, do we only look at the surface monitor data? Okay. The answer, I think, is not quite. Dominantly, you're right. Most data are surface monitors, but we try to coincide with our test time with intense campaign. For example, we have not entire country, but in some part of the country during Discovery EQ campaign, we have quite a bit data, a lot from airplane, from LiDAR, from tether sound and ozone sound. So we try to leverage those campaign data to verify our single model setting performance.
If I could just ask a follow-up. With the 42 layers, did it improve the model performance at these levels?
The question is, with the 42 reanalysis model setting, does it improve the model predictions aloft? Have we verified it? The answer is not yet. We have this curtain, as mentioned, is only for the post-analysis with 22 layers setting, and we have yet to do the 42 layers. Thank you for the question.
Thanks, guys. We'll move on to our next talk by Ms. Lee from Southeastern, and she's going to talk about Western U.S. high ozone plants.
Hello, hear me okay? Okay, my name is Mei-Yun Lin, and I'm a research scientist from Princeton University in the NOAA Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory. And I'm going to talk about year-to-year variability in Western U.S. high ozone events during spring, their relationship with climate regimes and stratified intrusion frequency. And in particular, I hope to tie the science we found to implications for Western U.S. air quality planning. And first, I want to acknowledge my collaborators, Arlene Fiore, Larry Horowitz, and all other people listed here. So to motivate the talk, first let me show you some observational and modeling evidence for the episodic impacts of stratified intrusions on Western U.S. surface ozone. So the map shows mean stratified ozone tracer in surface air during April to June 2010 as estimated by the GFDR AM3 model, global model at 50 by 50 kilometer resolution. And this is from the paper we published in 2012 in JGR. So you can clearly see that the stratospheric influence is have a greatest impacts over the intermountain west high altitude regions. And in the paper, we use daily ozone sound aircraft measurements, LiDAR measurements, to demonstrate that stratospheric intrusions play an important role in contributing to the day-to-day vulnerabilities of Western U.S. surface ozone. And on the right is a nice demonstration based on ozone sound observations at six sites over California, and you can clearly see that the isentropic substance of ozone from the lower stratosphere over the northern California all the way to the lower tropospheres of southern California. And the model indicates that southern Nevada is particularly susceptible to such isentropic substance of stratospheric ozone, but observations are lacking. So this has motivated the setup of Nevada Rural Ozone Initiative. It is a 6 to 13 site network starting from July 2011, running all the way to present, led by Rebecca Fine and May Gustin from the University of Nevada. And also there's a new field campaign, Las Vegas Ozone Study, deployed in May to June 2013, led by Andy Lanford. So I am pretty excited to use these new observations in conjunction with the DFDR-M3 model to look at further look at the impacts of stratospheric intrusions on surface ozone in southern Nevada. So the map shows observed daily maximum 8-hour average ozone on May 25th, 2013, highlighting the larger circles are the size exceeding the current 75 ppb NAS threshold. So you can see that on the right is the observations from the ozone LiDAR deployed over Las Vegas, and you can see the high ozone filaments were recorded by the LiDAR a few hours prior to enhancement at surface sites. And these high ozone filaments are enchained into the boundary layer in the afternoon of May 25th. And I can show you the surface analysis of time series analysis of surface ozone. So this time series shows daily maximum 8-hour average ozone as observed in black, simulated by the DFDR-M3 model in red, and stratospheric ozone tracer in blue. So this is a site located over here. So you can see that on the May 25th, the observed ozone exceed the NAS threshold, and model indicate strong stratospheric influence, so consistent with the high ozone filaments aloft observed by the LiDAR. So we are interested in understanding whether such events occurred each year, and what controls the frequencies of such events, and to what extent such events affect the frequencies of observed high ozone events and over the Western U.S. So understanding such year-to-year variability is crucial for developing a predict capability and screenings of exceptional events. And actually, so the air quality managers in the greater Las Vegas region, they are concerned about the influence of stratospheric intrusions in the recent years, and they have found in their local monitors that using the most recent 3 years of data, they will find the fourth highest daily maximum 8-hour average ozone will exceed the NAS threshold. So that's why understanding the year-to-year variability is very important, and that's what we hope to answer in a paper I led currently in revision. So you're looking at time series of median daily maximum 8-hour average ozone at 22 high altitude sites across the Intermountain West from 1990 to 2012. So observations are shown in black, model in red, and stratospheric ozone tracer using the y-axis in blue. So you can see that the model captures about 56% of observed interannual variability, and stratospheric ozone tracer can explain 43% of observed variability in observations and 74% in the model. So indicating that the stratospheric influence is the major drivers of observed ozone interannual variability. And then very interestingly, we find that observed ozone and stratospheric influence is lowest for the 2 springs following the Mount Pinatubo volcanic eruption, and increase in the springs following strong La Nina conditions, as highlighted here. And we find that the variability in stratospheric influence associated with Pinatubo volcanic eruption and with La Nina conditions is mainly affecting the high tails of observed daily surface ozone distribution in a statistically meaningful way. So you are looking at probability distributions of observed daily maximum and average ozone at the same set of sites in the previous slides. For the composites of springs following neutral conditions, El Nino conditions, La Nina, and the Mount Pinatubo eruption, respectively. So so this shows the statistical testing for the difference between the different samples. So it's basically telling us that the difference in the entire distribution are not statistically significant, but the increase in high tail above the median value is statistically significant. So you can see that there's an increase in the high tail for the La Nina springs is statistically significant as compared to the neutral and El Nino conditions shown in red and black, respectively. So we want to understand why. Why does the stratospheric influence and observed high ozone events are greatest following La Nina springs? So this, the right plot, the left plot shows the schematics of ENSO-related processes responsible for tropospheric ozone variability over the Pacific North America sector during April to May. So during, and then the right plot shows the median AM3 background ozone at 500 millibar. So during El Nino, the persistent extended subtropical jet stream transports more pollution from Asia, so which increase the mean ozone of the subtropical Pacific region as compared to the La Nina conditions. So the La Nina, the jet stream northwards over the Pacific. So you can clearly see these opposing signs change in mean ozone associated with ENSO. And this change in mean ozone increase following El Nino, decrease following La Nina is further confirmed by analysis of 40 years of observations at Mauna Loa Observatory. And this is a detailed analysis of these data are published by my paper in Nature Geoscience. And I have a poster out there fully devoted to this topic. And we find that we really need to consider the influence of climate variability and a shift in atmospheric circulation when detecting and attributing observed tropospheric ozone trend. So I'm happy to talk on that front line for the poster. And right now, let's focus on for the Western U.S. And you can see that for the Western U.S., the background ozone actually is even greater for the La Nina springs. And we find that this is consistent with the meandering polar jet stream following La Nina conditions. So this shows the polar jet meanders. This is actually the dynamical mechanisms in terms of jet location and how they vary are well understood in the climate community. And you can see that when the following La Nina condition, the jet meanders towards the Western U.S. So this will facilitate more frequent and stronger tropopause folding. And this is demonstrated in this plot. So this shows the variance in daily sulfur ozone tracer at 500 millibar. So we use these diagnostic as indicators of synoptic variability associated with sulfur ozone intrusion frequency. And you can see that the variance in model tracer is a factor of 2 to 3 greater following La Nina conditions as compared to the El Nino. And this explains why the high tails of observed surface ozone over the intermountain west increase following La Nina conditions. So now we're thinking about how, moving forward, how we can use the science, the mechanistic understanding we find to serve the Western U.S. air quality management needs. So you can see that so the tropical sea surface cooling associated with UNSO typically peak in winter. So as you can see that I will not point it this way, delaying my talk. Okay, so typically tropical surface sea surface temperature change associated with La Nina typically peak in winter, and we find that the response of Western U.S. surface, response of Western U.S. surface ozone occurred in the following spring. So there's a few months of time lag. So we are thinking, can we use this time lag to develop seasonal predictions to aid Western U.S. air quality planning? And examples of like using such information to managing emission controls to attain attack levels of air quality, or use the resources to develop day-to-day forecasting tools about the incoming sulfur ozone intrusions. So this is probability distributions of observed and simulated surface ozone in conjunctions with the influence of background ozone for the high background springs and low background springs. And you can see that for the high background ozone, high background means shutting off North American anthropogenic emissions in the model. So you can see that for the high background springs, there's less room for the additions of domestic emissions to before exceeding the national air quality standards. And this is my last slide. Another examples of using such seasonal prediction capabilities that if we know there's La Nina event going on in the last winter, and we can direct resources to forecast day-to-day events, such as showing here demonstrations of using Aura OMI for the episodic impact, and such information can indicate downwind surface influence, can be used for public health alerts, and such efforts has already been going on led by Pat Reddy from Colorado DEQ and Gail Tonison from EPA Region 8, and also the ACAS member Black Pierce. So we can further use the seasonal prediction to direct all such kinds of information to further help forecast such day-to-day surface ozone intrusion events. With that, thank you very much for your attention.
Yes.
Do you see any potential that this might be used to be able to quantitatively break out stratosphere from future from the western areas so that the lower lower standard you could get such a momentum status that you can form these lines?
Yeah, that's exactly what we do. So we have a tracer in the model to keep tracks of ozone transported from the stratosphere. So basically we are finding that if the standard will be lower, there was more frequent exceedance due to the surface influence.
Our next speaker is Ann Johnson from Goddard. She's going to talk about stratospheric intrusions and the impact on unrelated complications.
Okay, thank you very much. So, well set up by the previous speaker, for which I give thanks. And also my co-author, Brian Duncan, from this morning. So I've altered the title a little bit, but what we're doing here is trying to quantify, I'm looking at some different data, principally case studies. We're trying to synthesize soundings, aircraft data from some of our recent campaigns, as well as satellite data, and a tracer approach using a new version of GEOS-5 for this purpose. So the intrusions, we're calling them, Brian called it what, stratospherically influenced. You can call it influence or intrusions, whichever you like, but SI we're going to call it for short. Continue to be of concern to ACAS, both for impacts in the boundary layer and for policy relevant background or PRB ozone levels. And in fact, if you link the air quality part of forcings in free trope to the climate issue, there are questions besides just sort of health impacts to which this inquiry is related. So I've listed those who've gone before me. And analysis of ozone sondes starting 10 years ago with soundings that we analyzed from the network in Intex A. Hard to believe it's a decade, but I'm particularly at those soundings that were launched during the summer campaign in what I call MENA, Northeastern North America. So it is this region in maritime Canada, as well as analyses we made of the 2 Maryland sounding sites in the 2011 Discover campaign, show surprising persistence or of SI, if you will. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a little bit more examples from the tracer version of GEOS-5 that Brian introduced this morning, going back, showing a couple more things from one of the case studies he illustrated in 2011, but then show you more things that came in from Discover data last September, which was a Houston campaign, still having stratospheric influences even as we get into what's virtually the subtropics, and another network that we put together for SEACOAS last August and September. So the bottom line is we're sort of amazed at some of the fine features that the model captures, and what we want to look forward to as we anticipate some kind of thing that Mayun just mentioned is what more can we do, and here rather than in an interannual variability sense, I'm hoping that we can actually use some near real-time satellite data for this summer's experiment in Colorado, which is the last of the Discover campaigns. So what's illustrated here is a curtain of all of the soundings from the Edgewood, Maryland site These are the two, I mentioned here, the two periods that Leslie and Brian highlighted as SI events in this data record. Basically July of 2011. This shows the boundary layer heights, which are quite variable. This is a site that we've also publicized because it's not just SI affecting ozone in the lower troposphere. This is a big bay breeze problem area where a local microclimate also leads to air quality exceedances. So the boundary layer height's important here. And this is an ozone-caused tropopause, so to speak. So you're in this strat when you're in ground, but you are very likely in the upper trop strat influenced when you have anything above 60, 70 up through the red colors. So one of the events, which I'm not going to talk about, is the one that was on the 14th, but you can see influences after that. And I'm going to turn to the one on the 26th, 27th that Ron Duncan mentioned this morning. And we actually had only one sounding that day at Edgewood. So what I'm going to do instead is to show you some interesting corroboration by looking at the P3 data, because the one sounding was launched just as the airplane approached, and there actually are 3 spirals per day at the ground stations, but launches are only coincidentally 2. So this is what's depicted here is this is ozone mixing ratio in blue, humidity from the P3 in red, or in black, and then NOI, which is a tracer of surface pollution, is the red. So you can see in both cases, at about 1.5 kilometers, the ozone shoots up, getting at around 80 at 2.5, 3 kilometers, but the layer is very dry and the NOI drops off. And there's actually about a 10 ppb increase between the sort of 2 to 3 hours difference in these 2 spirals. So I want to look now at some of the interesting results that we got in August and September 2013. So let me orient you. We actually had, starting in August and going through about September 20th, we put together one of these intensive ozone saw network sound study campaigns with mostly existing stations. So 4 of these actually have data, some going, 3 of them going back 10 to 15 years if you want to look at annual variability. But several of them, like Socorro, New Mexico, for example, were also in our IONS 06 campaign. So the goals of Seekers, and Danielle was one of the chief honchos for directing the VC8, was to look at sources for natural and pollution variability in the West that might be associated with fires, so we have a couple of those stations. The North American monsoon was a darling of some of the Seekers group, those that wanted to find precip impacts and hurricanes, and then mixed sources, which might be fires, biogenic sources, and urban regions in the east. So the curtain I'm about to show you from Houston actually includes soundings from 3 different locations from August 8th through September 26th that were a combination. This is that Smith Point remote Discover site, but then 2 sites in the city of Houston, and also there was one actually in Texas, Oklahoma border. So Brian's already acquainted you with the characteristics of this version of GEOS 5 and the tracer studies. So here's the curtain of the Seekers only, Seekers and Discover overlap period, and then the Discover only. And Discover was very frustrated that there was, look at this, all this nice air, 30 parts per billion near the surface frequently in September. The only dirty day was really about the 25th of September, and right before that, 23-24 was one of these fronts that brought down some stratospheric air that we're going to look at briefly. And there was also influences of the lower trope of an episode on the 19th of August. So looking at the September, this is September 24th. These are the soundings, the ozone soundings at Smith Point, separated by about 4 hours. So as I said, it's remote, so it started out very clean at the surface. But in both cases, you can see that the high ozone layers, again, 80 or more parts per billion, but very dry air suggestive of stratospheric origins were above about 2.5 kilometers. And this doesn't project very well here, but if you go back and look at it, we just had this paper published on the Maryland data in Journal of Atmospheric Chemistry. Our code here is that sort of this rose shading tells you that there are laminae that were advected into the region of probable stratospheric origin. So those origins are suggested. Now, corroboration we try to get, again, out of the aircraft data. So the sounding is repeated here in light blue. The aircraft profile isn't always exactly the same time and location as where the sounding goes, but it's a pretty good agreement. And again, you see elevated ozone above 2 kilometers, more or less an NOI drop-off. We're still checking some of the other tracers, and they don't have CO illustrated here. A lot of times it drops in stratospheric air, as one would expect, and other times it's a little bit more ambiguous. As you know, ozone and CO correlations kind of big. So what do we get from looking at this episode with a tracer? So this is I need to give you a little introduction here. This is a cut along 95 degrees west. So that's a meridional cut, and then these are the latitudes from 50 to about 45, and this dotted line is the location of Houston. So if it's all red, it's 100% stratospheric origins, and then what we get between about 300 and 800 hectopascals here is more like 40 or 50% stratospheric influence. It's sort of surprising that this coincides very well with the region of some of those elevated ozone layers in the sounding. Now, the other thing, the other diagnostic we're getting from this tracer simulation is that the tracer is being introduced basically on a weekly basis throughout the sampling period, beginning of August to the end of September. So each week has a color associated with the pulse, and then it's tracked throughout. And so what you can see in this period is at 700 hectopascal, which is right about here, at the bottom of this thin intrusion, if you will. The influence of the stratosphere here, on average, is 20% or more. But if you drop to surface here, you're going down to very little, practically nothing, but not zero. It's more like 5 to 10% influence in this region for that period. Now, the other way to look at this, Brian showed one of these with a different color this morning, I think a different color scale. But now I'm going back to this August 19th case. And here I've just got the seekers, just the image that you can get from the website. Again, very dry, above about 600 or 700 hectopascals, elevated ozone layers, coincident. And here it's maybe a sort of 300 to 500, 600 hectopascal feature. This is about half of the ozone of those origins. But if you take a slice along one pressure or altitude level, here we're looking at 500 hectopascals. Here's that little yellow is Houston indicator for this event. This feature actually is going throughout the Gulf region, and even something not so different is going up the East Coast and toward the Maritimes. Again, you drop just down to 700 hectopascals, shouldn't be any influence, according to this cross-section, and in fact, there virtually isn't. So I think that degree of resolution is rather remarkable. Now, Jack Fishman isn't here, but I put this case study in for Jack because he organized on very short notice a sounding station in St. Louis. The aircraft didn't quite make it up there, but he sent us kind of 10, 11, 12 September, a front came through, and there was this amazing little, very, very thin lamina at around 7 kilometers, 436 hectopascals. You look at the slice here, this is along 90 degrees west in the latitude of St. Louis, so there you are. Again, this is significant influence of stratosphere in the air at this layer. And so if you take the slice at 500, this is the time period. And again, the influence is narrowly defined in time through this period, are actually much better than 20%, dropping down to the surface again, probably less than 5. So now you're asking, what does this have to do with what we're really supposed to be doing in the past? Doing something with satellite data. So these are really kind of a first look, first cut, thanks to Deborah Collin, and she went back and looked at OMI. This is OMI, a quarter degree data, just a sequence from 10 and 11 September. And the elevate, this is total ozone, of course, but there's definitely an elevation that shows the outline of stratospheric impact on total ozone. It does cover actually St. Louis and this part of the Midwest. It moves east the following day. And we also had benefit of our sampling during the satellite sampling during the campaign. Some test, step and stare maneuvers, as you know. This is all that they're doing these days. And so this is the path on this particular day, the 10th, as Tess is picking it up. And this is a very different color scale from the one that I've been showing you. So this blue-purple really discriminates. It's the 100 ppb sort of ozonopause, if you will. But you actually can see along this region, this is the other side of the state. My husband would remind you, there's St. Louis. So this is on its way, but it's not there yet. But you can indeed see near the surface some of this stratospheric air. So to summarize, the sense of persistence and ubiquity of these summertime stratospheric episodes that we think shouldn't be there, but they are, that we have been impressed with in our prior campaigns, are very much alive and well during the sampling we did last August and September. We're going to finish some case studies. I think we need some modeling to actually integrate total impact. That might take a little bit longer. But I also want to stress that what we're going to be doing in getting, as we do now in Discover campaign, near real-time satellite data and also forecasts from the GEOS-5, we hope to be able to watch these episodes as they develop this summer. And as we just were reminded in the last talk, Mayun told us, hey, you really want to look at where there's going to be impact. It's not so much going to be the east and Houston. It's going to be in the Mountain West, and that's where we and FRAPE will be working. So thanks.
Our last speaker is David Edwards of INFAR. He's going to talk about Colorado friendly air quality.
Good afternoon. I'm going to give an overview of some of the work we've been doing at NCAR for the Colorado Front Range air quality. A couple of pictures of the kind of situations we deal with in terms of wildfires, as well as urban pollution, as you can see there. My co-author on this and the person who did most of the modelling work is Gabriel. Okay, so I'm going to start off by talking about two things. One is the Frappe field campaign, which I'll come to at the end. First of all, I'm going to start off with an overview of some of the progress we've made on our Tiger Team project from a couple of years ago. This was in collaboration with the Colorado Department of Public Health and the Environment, CDPHE, and especially Team there led by Pat Reddy, and also Yang's group, Yang Zhenglu and Max Strickland from Emory University. So the goals here were to look at the fact that Colorado has been experiencing recently some very expensive fire seasons, especially in 2012, which experienced the worst we've ever had in terms of cost. And we wanted to establish the impacts of these wildfires on human health by doing an epidemiological analysis based on hospital emissions, especially for asthma emissions. And also we wanted to quantify some of the impacts of these fires on air quality and exceedances in particular. So here's kind of the framework of the modelling that we've been doing. Starting off at the top there, we have analysis of the satellite and surface observations, together with some air quality modelling of the fire impact and exposure. And with this, we've been using satellite retrievals from a number of sensors, together with surface observations from EPA, PASTEC, and NOAA. And the tool we've been using for most of this is the WRF-10 model. And also we've been combining this with health data provided by CDPHE, as I mentioned, in terms of hospitalizations due to asthma. We've been looking at two outcomes of this work. First is using these the modelling and the data that we've been analysing here, having a look at the contribution of the fires, the impact of the fires in terms of air quality exceedances, and combining with the health data here, looking at the value of this kind of analysis, kind of predicting the strains that we might put on a health provider in terms of admissions to a hospital or emergency room visits for asthma and cardiovascular problems during the fire event. There are a number of challenges associated with it, and I'll say up front that these are quite extensive challenges, and in fact one of the main drivers for the Frappe field campaign is to try and understand some of these challenges and these drivers in a bit more detail. The front range is obviously complex topography and complex flow patterns. We have a diverse mix of sources from urban agriculture, especially oil and gas, as has been mentioned, and also the fires. We are impacted by long-range transport from outside of the area. And in terms of the fires, these are highly variable sources with localized impacts, and we also have a limited set of observations of evaluation. The modelling setup is as shown here. We've done a number of simulations, or Gabby Fisser has, at two resolutions. We look at 12 kilometers and 4 kilometers in WRF-10, and these have been done with a varying different descriptions of the meteorology, the emissions, and the physics, as detailed below here. So the meteorology was looked at using observation nudging or data assimilation, and these actually provide similar statistics, but neither really fully capture the complex flow patterns that we see. Data assimilation provides probably a better simulation, however, it's very much more expensive. As you might imagine, we're using an ensemble cognitive assimilation system, DART, and this works out as being very much more expensive than the nudging. We've looked at a number of anthropogenic emission inventories for Colorado specifically, on the CDPHE 2008 and the projections of 2018. For the ACME 2010 in comparison campaign, and NEI for 2011 and projected 2011 as well. Fire emissions, we've used the NCAR FIN model. This turned out to be too low, too low emissions when we used just the base model, which was based on the notice fire count. This has since been updated to include the SmartFire burnt area product, as Len mentioned this morning, and this gives an improvement. However, both of these estimates are very different from the Mesa inventory. Here's just an example of some of the differences that you see. This is showing antigen emissions for NO and for propane, the indication of the oil and gas work. Shown here is the CDPHE projection for 2018, and here is the difference between the actual CDPHE and the NEI 2011 CDPHE. And we can see in the case of the NO that things are not too different. There's about 22, 27% difference in both between these two inventories and the CDPHE. Things are quite different when it comes down to looking for the propane, which is an indication of what the difference is due to the oil and gas exploration. In this case, it's minus 200% when compared to the inventory, and this is basically because this doesn't include a lot of the recent oil and gas emissions that we get in the area. And then actually, when you compare it with the NEI of 2011, this NEI 2011 appears to give us very much more detail of the different basins, oil exploration basins you can see here. And this is due to the fact that this is due to a projection of the from the CDPHE 2008 inventory, which was really before all of this exploration took place. As you can see here, this is mapping to very well towards the different oil fields and oil gas fields that we have in the area. This is the largest Denver one that we'll be looking at, especially during that end. Excuse me. Okay, in terms of exceedance demonstrations, one thing we wanted to do here was to look at provide input to some of the exceedance demonstrations for ozone events as identified by CDPHE. And these are events. This is showing the record from one of the stations in the Rocky Mountain National Park, and we're looking at these two events here in June 17th and on July 4th. This might not have necessarily been exceedance events for this particular station, but as you can see here from the surface monitors from the different stations around, these were significant events. So looking first at this one in June of June 17th event, 2012. This was at the time of the High Park fire. This is Fort Collins here in, along the front range. And you can see this is a Moses image, and you can see very large plumes coming out of the fires here. This was a very significant event which resulted in a lot of fire evacuations and really impacted the local community here with quite considerable damage and loss of structures during this time. How do we do with the modelling with this? Well, this is an example of Wolf Chem with the QPEG fires and the Wolf Chem without fires. So this is a fire, no fire example. And what's shown on here is the ozone and the PM2.5 coming from the Wolf Chem analysis, and also on here is the station, the monitoring site data. So we can see in the case of the ozone, definitely we have downwind of the fires. There is a significant impact here of the fire, but it's also interesting to note here over the region of the fire, there's actually less ozone in this particular case than there is with the simulation without the fire. I think this is probably due to the increased aerosol loading, which is demonstrated here, leading to lower ozone production and or it's either that or perhaps too much NO being produced in the region as well. In the case of the PM2.5, there's a very clear indication here of the fires, and you get quite good agreement with the ground-based data, as you can see here. Moving on, this is just to show kind of some of the problems or some of the challenges that this has resulted in. This is actually 4 simulations here, each using Wolf Chem, but using different input parameters. This is using the QFED. This is assuming not using the clean rice model. This is using the thin inventory for the fires, and this is using QFED with a 4 kilometer resolution rather than And you can see in each of these simulations, we get quite different results. So it shows within this particular regime how sensitive the simulation is to the initial ignition that you choose. Here's an example of this is we're trying to get this event here, which we really don't do particularly well. However, we know that at least the fires are having some impact. So it's spreading these in these models, which is shown here by the standard deviation among the different members of the ensemble that's been done, is greater after the fire. So at least the fires we know are having some impact. That other event I talked about on July the 4th, this is the transport. Here's a picture from downtown Denver showing this downtown Denver scene obscured by smoke from fires coming down from Wyoming and South Dakota region. And this is shown here. Here's the aerosol optical depth from MODIS, showing this event coming down here, the transport from these fires which were further north, which are actually shown on picture very nicely in this EASI plot shown here. So here in South Dakota, with these events coming down here, they were also picked up by Moffett. Just as a side of interest, there was also some intense fires here in Oregon at the time, leading to a very nice blue that spans across the northern states there. WolfChem, in this case again, we were underestimating the aerosol loading. Obviously, there's an influence of it, but we are underestimating at the same time. Looking at the ozone, with the ozone, we get high ozone resulting from this transport from the fires. In fact, it might be slightly overestimated compared to the monitoring sites in many cases. Although, however, it's probably good to point out that some of these monitoring sites did show ozone levels as high as 100 ppb to the 8-hour average at the time. Excuse me. As I mentioned before, the aerosol is underestimated in this case, although there is obviously a significant impact from the fires themselves. So what we wanted to do originally with this study, with this tiger team activity, was to really close the loop and try and see what the impact of these fires were on hospitalization. And this is a slide from Young's group. This is work with Emory, where they took they basically took the exposure maps, which usually filter because of pollutant, the PM2.5 ozone that we produce at NCAR using WolfChem, and tried to correlate this using a regression model to try to correlate this with the data that they got from the Colorado Department of Health and from the Colorado Hospital Association, hospitalization, and emergency department data. So you can see in terms of odds of the visit to the emergency room, we do get this during this time period of the fires between 1st of June and 10th of July. We do get this positive correlation, and this impact significant. Although we have some concerns about the amount of data that actually went into this, and so one of the next steps on this study is perhaps to look at some different fire periods as well, and see if we can bolster the results. But certainly tantalizing at the moment from this study. And this is one of the first studies to look at the concentration response effect of the PM2.5 over a long-lasting fire period. Moving on, I just wanted to talk a little bit about Trahe and Discover AQ. This has been mentioned a few times now. So the Discover AQ is the NASA project aircraft campaign, which is going to come to the front range, and almost as a response to the fact that NASA were coming, we're going to have another campaign called Trahe out of the it's going to be led out of NCAR, and it's funded by the by NSF and also by the Colorado Department of Health and Environment as a component from the Colorado United States. So they put a lot of money into this, and they're funding to the local universities to the instrumentation to fly on this. So the goals of FRAPPE are basically to mesh with the goals of Discover HQ, which are some time ozone and non-occasion, and try to understand better this complex topography and ecology and the relationship to photochemistry, etc., that we have in the floodplain. It's also to look at the diverse set of emission sources that we get: urban, oil, gas, industrial, agricultural, biogenic, bio, and obviously here there is a very large amount of interest in the oil and gas exploration that's going on in the region. We're interested in looking at the impact of this downwind region. It's nice looking at around about Denver, because in some ways Denver is a fairly isolated large source in an otherwise region where there are no other very large sources. So it's an area where we can look at the influence of a large urban source on the surrounding area. And also we're looking at inflows from other states as well. So here's the NASA Discover HQ flight patterns that people are getting used to now. It's flying a fairly strict pattern with spirals taking a specific ground sites several times a day, hopefully. And NASA will have the P3 there, the Clean Air, and also the NASA Falcon, which will, of interest to this group, will be carrying the geocacher instrument from Ball Aerospace, the Genesius instrument, and this is a kind of it's a good indicator of what we might be able to get from the Tempo or the GEMS geostationary instrument when they eventually fly. It's a good test bed for some of those missions. It's a lot of very interesting work to produce. FRAPPE, at the same time, is going to be looking at, is going to be flying this more diverse pattern, if you like, and looking especially at to see what comes into the area by using C150 to C130 to fly around the edges, as well as that's what happening over the area itself. So we want to be able to characterize what we get in terms of input and output into the region, which will be looked at in very much more detail by Discover HQ. Here's an example of doing it at the moment. We're very busy with them getting forecasts together. Both meteorological forecasts and chemical forecasts. And here's an example using WAR with a tracer to show you this is a three-day loop, and the shift in the weather patterns, the wind patterns, and a tracer for oil and gas. The fact that we keep going up and high and low is not indicating a varying variation in the source, so much as the up and down of the boundary layer, which can go from a few hundred feet up to the 25 kilometers in the afternoon. So kind of complex flow patterns are going to be interesting. And I'll leave you with that for the final slide on that.
Are there any long-term health impacts with events like that?
Long-term health impacts? I think it's well known. Well, Yang would be a better person to ask that, but as far as I know, it's more of an acute thing for people who have got asthma problems already, the kind of thing that can really put them over the edge. I mean, certainly if you're in these environments where there's a lot of smoke coming through, as we have been several seasons now, even in Boulder, I mean, you can really feel it in the back of your throat. And for people even who don't have those kind of problems, chronic problems of that kind, it's very uncomfortable.
Thank all the speakers for the session, and we will have a 10-minute break. Get back at 2:00. Thank you.
Good.
Yeah, we're going to heads up on the rest of the afternoon.
Oh, so
we're going to have the first
yes,
session
I thought
chaired
you
by
were having
Greg Carmichael. At
something.
the end of the set, after the presentation, we're going to have a discussion panel in which we'll ask speakers to sit in front, chairs like this. It'll work out just fine, and then we'll pepper them with questions. Looking forward to that.
Okay, thank you, Danielle. Yep, we're going to begin the first air quality management session. So we're going to start with Rich, and he's going to talk about the title that we have in front of us.
Thanks. Thank you all. Thanks. I mean, I feel really energized looking at all the data sets that you guys have been working on. Now, as I see it from a CDC perspective, these are all exposure data sets that could be used for health-related work. And some of the work that we've been doing in the last 10 years is actually, gathering all the environmental data sets and the health data sets in one place so that people, like the layman, public can access the data sets without, going through a lot of data processing or, using software and things like that. So today I will be giving you an overview of my program. Then I would sort of like, go on to my website and show you how you can query things and how the data are laid out there. So the program, the Environmental Public Health Tracking Network, which is sort of housed in CDC, it's been around for like 10 years now. And it came about because of the Pew Commission's report and saying like how disjuncted the environmental health surveillance systems are. So there needs to be one place where you can actually get all the data. So as a result of that, Congress funded CDC to come up with this program, and then we got started in 2002. And then what we've been doing is the monies that we get are given to states, universities, and other partners to actually do some of the work that, in terms of collecting data, in terms of like bringing them on the same scale. Often the health and the environmental data sets are collected on such a geographic scale. So we try to bring them on the same scale and address specific local issues, and also in a consistent way. So we have several partners because like the data that we get, some of those we do it in-house, but many of those data sets are got from national partners. So we collaborate with EPA, and actually the demo that I'll be showing will touch on some of the air quality data sets that we get from EPA, and it's been a very productive partnership. And then we also work with NASA, and we also work with NOAA, so we have several MOUs and then we work with universities. So we just finished a cycle of broad agency agreements with universities where we identify a specific project or a specific topic area under which several universities compete, and we're able to synthesize the results from those studies and those reports into something more meaningful, like an indicator or measure that could be used to inform the public about a problem in their localities. And then the backbone of our program is our state and local health department. So we have 23 states and one local jurisdiction, which is New York City, and we sort of like have this cooperative agreements with the state where we fund them and they can actually look at what's happening in their locality, in their area, what's of relevance to them, in addition to like doing something that's nationally consistent. So there are several content areas in terms of like our topic areas. So the health effects that we have available, the data that we have available, touch on several health effects that have a possible link to the environment. And I will be showing you some of the work that we've been doing with our asthma partners. Also, cancer-related work. We have information on that from the National Program of Cancer Registries. And then our environmental data sets. So primarily, we have to collect information on air, water, and also some cross-cutting areas like climate change. And then we have some contextual data that is some population data, and also we now branched into some biomonitoring exposures. And then we have some health behavior, like information like smoking, obesity prevalence, diabetes prevalence, which are connected to, which are confounders. So now I will try to work this through and show a demo of our portal. Yeah, thanks. So this is our landing page, or this is our home page. So we have organized all our information into these different buckets or different areas, content areas. And then we also have some contextual information. So we have so our network is actually a collection of networks too, because like we have information from our state programs, and each of those programs have their own networks. And each of those networks have different data and some consistent overlapping information, but mostly something that's applicable to their local jurisdiction. And there are like different information available from each of those networks, but I will be just covering the national. Oh yeah, static. Sorry about that. So I will actually, since we don't have much time, I'll go to the part where we query data. And so this is like actually giving the user direct access to some of the data sets we have, and then you can actually query information using this website. And so all the information that we have are organized based on these broad topic areas. And then we have under each, let's say I pick air quality. And then under these, like air quality, there are several indicators and measures. And let's say I pick the measure like mortality. Hope I picked the right measure. Right. And then and under this, like, so we have information about like, so what's the number of deaths prevented or the change in rate for a reduction in PM2.5. So we have it for all-cause mortality as well as coronary artery disease or ischemic heart disease mortality. So we sort of say if a particular county were to lower its PM levels by certain percent, what's going to be the number of deaths avoided. So it's sort of like very similar to the BenMap framework that you are aware of. And the construct is similar, but the inputs that we use are slightly different from what BenMap uses. And then I'll pick Alabama. And then let me pick a few years so I could go over some of the functionalities we have. So I guess like instead of being very prescriptive about like what the reduction should be or can be, we just let the user choose what the reduction they want to use. Like for example, we defaulted to 10%. But if you want to look at a scenario where you could reduce the PM2.5 levels by different percentage levels, then you can always do that, and then we sort of provide numbers based on that. So I guess like so any measure or any indicator that you query will always have these. The map is sort of like our underpinning display, and then each of that will also have a chart and a table. So for the map, for example, like if I want to like look at 2 different years, compare like for a given reduction in PM2.5, how does it fare? You can do that, and then if I link the two, so each, and if I hover, like I say, for example, 2 different years, like 2005 and 9, this is for a 10% reduction in PM. I could sort of see what the deaths avoided are. So for example, maybe the PM levels in Alabama in 2004 are much higher than what it was in 2009. So that's why it's sort of telling you the number of deaths avoided is lower. So if you invert it, that's sort of the number of deaths you actually would see for a level comparing 2005 and 2009. So, and those things, and then you have the option of looking at, like if you can query 9 years if you want to, you could have like animation. This is all geared at like, people who are not very capable of providing animations or things like that. You could use that, you could take it to your stakeholder and show what the problem is. And then one other thing is what we've also done is, so these are other contextual factors which confound or modify the risk of the relationship between PM and your health effect. So what we've done is we've sort of like looked at different levels of these covariates, and what you can do is if you want to look at the relationship between the PM levels and the number of deaths avoided maybe for cardiovascular disease, you could select counties that fit that profile. For example, if this is adult obesity, and I could look at, in places where you have high obesity, and when I hit run query, it's going to give me just those counties which have a high obesity prevalence, and see what the PM, what the reduction in deaths are because of that reduction in PM. So those things you can do, and we're not changing the exposure-response relationship here. It's still the same. You're just using this as a filtering tool to actually look at counties where, if you want to, let's say, focus on areas where you have low smoking or high smoking, things like that, you could do that and get information. So, Rick, so, and that's something that I would like to show on air quality, and then let's move to climate change. So here, climate change, we have like different contextual information. One thing we haven't been able to do, or it's not up on the portal yet, is looking at some futuristic scenarios that is projected levels, be it air quality or extreme temperatures. So we are maybe this week or next week we're going to have information on how extreme heat, projected in a future scenario is going to look like. So the number of extremely hot days, we're going to have that on our website. So right now what we have is like long-term retrospective information about temperature and extreme heat events. So this, yeah, so I guess like I'll just pick one easy measure here. So this is sort of telling you for 1979 through 2011 how many hot days a particular county had, or particular state or county had. And if I pick one, maybe like 1 year here and then 2010. And one thing I want to show, I'm not going to run this measure, it takes some time, but here again, like there are so many different definitions available for what you call an extreme heat event. So instead of being very prescriptive here again, we sort of let the user decide what a definition should be or could be. So, and also we say it could be whether based on a daily maximum temperature or daily heat index, taking into account humidity levels. And also we sort of let the user set the threshold. It could be either an absolute threshold, which is based on an absolute temperature, or something more relative, that is like different percentile thresholds. So again, giving the user the flexibility of choosing what the definition needs to be, and if a definition is chosen, what how the results could change. Essentially comparing the sensitivity of different EHE definitions. So I'll stop here because it sort of takes some time to query this data set. So I'm happy to take questions.
Okay. So the response functions we're using in here, are those based, what are those based on? Are those national responses? Or those state by state? Because we know at least different EPI studies show different results in different states.
So the exposure response functions we've chosen is from the Krusty study, Daniel Krusty study. It's based on a Health Effects Institute report. So they looked at this in, I think, 120 cities, and then they sort of like maybe meta-analyzed as to like a national estimate. So it's conducted in different cities within the U.S., and they have one meta-analyzed estimate, which is what we were using, just to make sure.
Using the national meta-analysis number back out to, even though we may have specific relationships from those cities.
Yeah, because like I don't think we have that information published. That is, we don't have like a direct link to that database where all the list of those exposure response functions are for those different cities. So instead of comparability's sake, we just use one function and say this is what we use. And I forgot to mention, so each measure you have something called an about. It just describes how we got there. So in there we clearly say why we use that particular CR function.
Okay, thank you. I think we'll move on, and there'll be hopefully plenty of time for panel discussion to come back to some of these topics. Thank you very much. Okay, the next presentation is going to be by Scott Dolwick. He's going to be talking about estimates of background ozone in the western U.S. Thanks, Greg.
Okay, great. Thanks, Greg. So I'll be talking about background ozone. I'll also be up on the panel session, so to the extent that there are follow-up questions, you'll get 2 cracks at it. And so in talking about background ozone, I think it's been well established, in large part through some of the efforts of this community here, that although this goes back over a decade, that background ozone sources and processes can influence ozone concentrations at the surface over parts of the U.S. in certain seasons. As Mayun said in her talk, accurately characterizing background ozone is sort of the first step as you develop your conceptual model and your ultimate plan for an effective implementation or mitigation approach to air quality management. I do think it's a clear example of ACAS's success, and I definitely want to applaud the work that this group has done. Hopefully we can talk more about that in the panel discussion. Before you sort of jump into the topic of background ozone, though, I think it's important to make sure that everybody's on the same page. So definitions of background ozone can vary. Sort of what's background to any person is probably a function of where they sit and what air they breathe. So I'll talk clearly about hopefully clearly, about one definition of background ozone, U.S. background, and how it varies with 2 different modeling methodologies, how its estimation varies. Another thing to keep in mind is it impacts vary greatly across space and time. So, a high elevation site in the late spring, early summer western U.S. Can react quite differently than a site, say, in a low elevation location of the southeast U.S. And background ozone can be generated by a variety of processes, and I think we've already touched on most of them this morning and early this afternoon. So you have fires, you have stratospheric influences, you can have agent transport. Again, depending on your definition of background, maybe you have regional transport, you have these sort of long-lasting ozone precursors like methane. And I guess the reason to keep that in mind from a policy perspective is the way sort of you interact with the Clean Air Act can differ depending on what the process is that leads to that particular element of background ozone. And I think I can talk a little bit more about that as we walk through this. It's difficult to measure, typically requires air quality monitoring, and then nonlinear, the nonlinear aspects of ozone chemistry can sort of complicate identifying the influence of background. So as the title indicated, I'm going to be talking about 2 different methodologies for estimating background ozone: zero out and source apportionment modeling. Okay, so a lot of this comes from, if you're following the 5-year cycle of NAAQS review, you know that we're in the midst, EPA is in the midst of reviewing the ozone NAAQS, and a lot of this work is summarized in our first draft policy assessment, which came out late last year. we did two separate analyses. One is zero out, or an emissions perturbation approach. And so the two methodologies are answering two different questions. So the zero out modeling, I think many folks in the room are familiar with this. It's answering the question, what would ozone be in the absence of X, some certain set of anthropogenic precursors. We've used this approach quite often, going back to some of the work that Arlene Fiore did in 2002, 2001. It's frequently used to estimate background ozone, and it allows you some flexibility in estimating. So there's been a couple of different terms. There's natural background, there's North American background, which used to be called policy relevant background, US background. Depending on how you interface with your global, and regional models. If you do a nested approach, you have some flexibility in establishing how you define background. One of the frequent criticisms that we get with respect to zero-out approach is it's a counterfactual. It's something that can't happen in true policy space. And so in one regard, as you start to get away from the true intent of emissions perturbation modeling, which is just a central global what-if type question, and you start to translate to policy-type concerns, you have to be somewhat careful about how you apply the zero-out modeling in the policy context. So in the interest of trying to broaden our characterization, EPA, as I said in this latest round of review, decided to try to supplement our analysis with a different type of modeling, source apportionment, which again I think many in the room are very familiar with, but it's answering an entirely different question. The question source apportionment is tended to answer is how much of the current ozone in your model is from a specific source, and that source can be the state of Georgia, it can be your boundary conditions, it can be Asia, however you configure your model, whatever sort of impacts you want to apportion, or however you want to apportion out your air quality problem, how you identify that is what comes out of the source apportionment modeling. It's been widely used in rulemaking regulatory support modeling that we do in OAQPS, EPA's Office of Air Quality Planning Standards, which I should have said is whom I represent, in the context of like the NOx SIP call and CARE and some of the major regional NOx reductions in the eastern U.S. over the past decade. We've used this tool to sort of estimate the state-by-state contributions. It's sometimes used to look at sector-by-sector contributions. It hasn't, to my knowledge, until a paper earlier this year, been applied to the background ozone question. The limitation, if you will, or one thing to keep in mind is it may be more policy relevant, but it puts particular pressure, substantial pressure on sort of the approach you're using to do the tagging. So it's kind of cliche to say something's more art than science, and I don't think that's necessarily the case with tagging or source apportionment, but it's important to keep in mind that different modelers, different models can make different assumptions about how to tag something or how to allocate ozone formation in particular. Okay. I know there's a lot of words on this slide, so I'm just going to go through this real quickly. It'll be available. So we did two sets of regional scale modeling with CMAQ and with CAMX. We used meteorology from WRF. We were looking at the year 2007. The boundary conditions came from a coarser scale GeoSchem run. We were using 2008 NEI version 2 emissions. We configured, we weren't really using day-specific emissions. We were intending to capture sort of seasonal mean ozone levels, so we used 7-year average wildfire emissions. And then we did 4 runs with CMAQ and 1 run with CAMX. And so the 4 CMAQ zero-out runs were a base simulation. Then we zeroed out all global anthropogenic precursor emissions, plus we tried to reset the methane levels in GeoSchem to pre-industrial levels, and we looked at the ozone that remained, and that's natural background. Then we did a North American background run, which just zeroed out anthropogenic ozone precursors in North America, kept methane levels the same. U.S. background is just tightening the reductions into just the U.S. In the source apportionment modeling, we tracked the 4 lateral boundaries, the top boundary, U.S. anthropogenic emissions, and then the 5 other sectors listed in parentheses there. For those that are familiar with the CAMX modeling, we use the APCA approach, which whenever you get sort of interactions between biogenic and anthropogenic ozone precursors, it attributes the ozone formation to the anthropogenic precursor. Model performance is fairly reasonable. I know that's a kind of a cop-out term. There's more details in our appendix to the policy assessment. But from a seasonal mean, the CMAQ model tended to overestimate across the U.S. We're seasonal mean I'm defining as April to October. We tended to overestimate ozone by about 3.5 ppb. CAMX was showed a little less bias. Quickly go through this slide, but so it's showing the x-axis. We've binned the model predictions into 5 ppb increments, and I apologize. I know the x-axis is probably illegible from anywhere beyond maybe a foot. But we're starting from a bin that's all model predictions less than 25 ppb, and then it's 5 ppb increments up from that. And we're showing the fraction of, in the top plot, U.S. background, or what was left after we reduced all U.S. anthropogenic emissions, is the numerator, and the denominator is your total ozone. And so the fraction for these particularly low values, and then the box of the distribution is all sites, all 8-hour daily peaks, or MDA8. So for these very low levels, the zero out very frequently says that all the ozone in the model has background origins. And in some cases, this ratio can be greater than 1 in the zero out approach. In the source apportionment approach, which is answering a different question, how much of the modeled ozone can be attributed? Well, by default, you can't go greater than 1. You know, from a policy perspective, the takeaway that we typically take from this is somewhat of a good news story is as you get to the higher levels of ozone, those instances where you're closer to the ozone NACs or ozone exceedances, background tends to be a lower fraction of the problem. You see that both in the zero-out modeling and the source apportionment modeling. The slope's a little different. I need to move on. This is a little simpler, which is just the seasonal mean background levels from both model approaches. So the top plot, again, is the zero-out, and the bottom plot is source apportionment. Each mark is a place where we had an ozone monitor in 2007, so we've just extracted the model grid cell for that monitor. Takeaway here, U.S. background about 40 to 45 ppb in Intermountain West, very similar to some of the information that Mei Yun showed and something we've seen in the past. Same sort of season, or excuse me, spatial distribution in the source apportionment runs, but the values are a little less. I'll show difference plots now, and I'm going to show them 2 ways. So this is just, the top plot here is just a straight difference of the 2 plots that were on the slide before. The scale here is pretty small, so the gray colors are the 2 different approaches. We're within 2.5 ppb of each other in terms of characterizing what we're calling U.S. background. The warmer colors start to show 2.5 to 5 ppb, where zero out is higher than source apportionment modeling. Orange is 5 to 10, reds at that site, the zero out shows that there's as much as 10 ppb more U.S. background. The cool colors, of which there aren't many, would indicate that the source apportionment modeling is a higher estimate. One thing that we're pretty cognizant of, and right off the bat, is we're using 2 different models. We're using CMAQ, we're using CAMX. So we attempt to do a bias adjustment to sort of account for the model differences, and so that's what we're seeing in the bottom plot. Is after we've done a sort of simple accounting for the biases in the base cases between CMAQ and CAMX, what do those differences look like? And it's very encouraging, particularly in the area of most interest, which is sort of from the San Joaquin Valley to about the 100th meridian. Not to say that background issue is completely non-issue outside of that area, but that sort of box, if you will, is our prime focus in most discussions about background ozone. We can see that the 2 approaches, even though they're different questions being asked, are providing very similar estimates of background ozone. And then, so on the preceding plot, the difference is a lot of the points were sort of overlapping one another. Where we still see sort of lingering differences, and this makes sense with respect to ozone chemistry, are in the core urban areas. So LA, Bakersfield, maybe up to Fresno. That's where you still see pretty strong indications when you use the zero-out approach. You're going to get slightly higher background estimates. And I think that makes sense because it's these urban emissions which are, when they exist in the modeling and you allow them to exist in the source apportionment, are titrating out the ozone. When you remove everything locally, or all anthropogenics in the zero-out cases, you sort of expose, if you will, I don't know if you call it latent ozone or hidden ozone, but a lot of that background gets assigned with the zero out that won't get assigned with the source apportionment. So just real quickly with conclusions, and then I'll go to, hopefully if I have time, Greg, just for a recommendation slide. And I think you guys can read this as well as I can. We did 2 separate modeling analyses. I guess the bottom line is, while there's tendency for the zero out approach to estimate higher background ozone levels, particularly in urban areas, once we did the bias adjustment, we were pretty encouraged that the 2 approaches were relatively similar, both in the spatial, I didn't talk about it, but seasonal and magnitude levels in terms of estimating background ozone. So we think that's going to help bolster confidence in our background ozone estimates. Then last slide, just in terms of, I guess, maybe more personal or OAQPS recommendations for ACAST, knowing that we'll talk about this. There have been a lot of recent analyses that have characterized background ozone, and this probably is an exhaustive list, but going back to some of the work that was done in Danielle's group, all the way through some of this modeling that I just summarized. And I think they've all sort of confirmed the general nature of background ozone. I think we have a pretty good handle of the sort of conceptual model of background ozone and what its magnitude is. Others may disagree, and I encourage that in the question-answer session. And you know, we know it's a particular problem in the Intermountain West. We know as the ozone standard gets lowered and anthropogenic emissions in the U.S. get removed, it's going to be an increasingly larger portion of the total ozone. I guess my suggestions for next generation ACAST analyses, and I think this talk may be about 18 months out of phase because I think it's already started, which is very encouraging, is more and more efforts to sort of quantify the individual components of background, so the fire, stratosphere, Asia, methane, etc. You know, I think from policymaker, my sort of conceptual model of ozone formation is you have the local contribution, you have what I'll just call regional contribution, or sort of everywhere else in the U.S., and you're going down sort of a scale of controllability from sort of most controllable to least controllable. And so then you start to get to things like, you know, the Canada and Mexico, where we may have a little bit more control. International emissions, maybe we can enter into annexes or certain partnerships. Fires may, at some level, have some element of control. And then you get to, and certainly global methane has control, although the time frame for when you'll see those impacts is a little slower. And then you get to things that are sort of uncontrollable entirely, certain fires, stratospheric influence, lightning, etc. Quickly, I think we've done a lot of work in the base years. Excited to see some of the work that Danielle teed up about climate change and what background might look like in the future. You know, maybe not all the way out to 2100 from a regulatory standpoint, but in the time frame of 2020, 2030, as states will need to submit plans to attain the NAAQS, what do we think background will look like in those years? Always looking for opportunities to sort of ground truth model estimates of background. And then last, one of the things that we're interested in is sort of going straight to unified hemispheric regional modeling. So either finer scales in models like Mozart or GeoSChem, or going to larger scales in models like CMAC and CAMEX. And with that, I'll stop.
Very nice. We have lots of things to discuss in to take into the ACAST discussions. Yes?
So I'm curious if the states, when they submit their plans for future regulation, do they need to take into account climate change, or is that just one sentence in the report?
Yeah, it's an active topic of discussion right now. Our group sort of writes the guidance on how you do the SIP attainment demonstrations, and our recommendation to this point has been not to mandate that climate change must be taken into account if you do a SIP for, say, 2025. And our rationale has been 3 or 4-fold. 1, the shorter time frames. 2, the sort of variability across climate scenarios and climate models. It'd be, you know, from a workload standpoint, states don't really have the ability to do sort of the ensemble modeling that you might need to do to sort of characterize what the air quality impacts are. We're doing a lot of work at EPA. I know the community at large is doing a lot of work to try to characterize that, the ozone climate penalty, if you will. What will the impacts be on wildfires? A lot of the great work that you've done, and how do we account for that going forward? But right now, EPA's recommended guidance is if a state wants to consider it, they certainly can, but they're not mandated to do that.
Excellent. That's a great place to stop, and thank you. We'll be able to pick up further questions in the panel discussion coming up. So we have another EPA talk here. So we have Lexi going to talk on the EPA's emissions modeling platform.
Okay, great. Hi, everybody. I'm Alexis Zubro. I'm also from OAQPS with Pat Dolick. So I'm on the emissions side. I'm also in Region 1 in Boston. So for those of you who are in Boston, I'm down the street from you, and hopefully we can get some good collaboration. Here are some of my partners in the emissions modeling team, and I'm here to talk a little bit about how the sausage is made. You guys are doing some great stuff with top-down analysis of emissions and of air quality. Well, this is kind of the bottom-up side of it. And hopefully we'll kind of bring up a good discussion of where we can meet in the middle. Should I just use this? That's fine. Okay, I apologize, this is a little smaller than I hoped it would be. So let me talk a little bit about the NEI and the kind of where we start with emissions. So the NEI is on which is the National Emissions Inventory, is on a full year cycle. Are you going to be able to zoom it in? That'd be great. So it's on a full year cycle. It's a 3-year cycle, and we're currently on the 2011 cycle, and the next one will be, of course, 2014. And this is a kind of collaboration across multiple scales. We have submissions from states, locals, thank you, and tribals, and they're actually required to submit criteria pollutants, things like NOx, VOC, etc. And there is this actual regulatory there's actually a regulatory rule that kind of requires and defines exactly what they need to submit, and this is called the AERR. In addition, they can optionally submit other things, for example, greenhouse gases, toxics, or hazardous air pollutants. And we use something called the Emissions Inventory System, the EIS, which allows us to kind of interleave these various data sets and kind of create a data hierarchy where we can say, okay, for particular sectors or sources, we may choose to take the state data over EPA estimates, or at times we may decide that we need to pull in a different data set of various other forms and kind of place those over each other. And this kind of creates this quilt of various data that's here. And so on the left is an example for solvent dry cleaning, so a particular sector of the emissions. And we can see that, you know, the kind of light areas are areas where the EPA has made estimates for those states. The dark gray area, the light gray areas are areas where the states have provided kind of all the pollutants. And the blue areas are areas where there's kind of a mixture of both EPA and state data. And as you go from sector to sector, you would find a different map. So this is, again, this kind of quilt idea. So thinking about the NEI as one kind of consistent, uniform data set is really not correct. It's really coming from various data sources, which is actually tracked with the NEI if you really want to dive into it. But it is kind of placed together and tried to make semi-consistent. On the right is another example. The on-road sector is a very important sector for emissions. There's been a lot of discussion of that. And in this case, we're actually using a model to typically estimate those emissions, the ROOS model of OTAC, or EPA. And here, the dark blue areas indicate states that give us inputs to use for the model, and the lighter areas are indicated where we're using EPA defaults, estimates of things like VMT, age distribution of vehicles, etc. Okay, so that kind of gives you a little bit of background on the NEI. Now I want to talk a little bit about kind of trends and some of the analysis that we do within the emissions inventory analysis group, the area that I'm in. And we evaluate trends across years and across space. And one of the things that we really want to try and think a little bit about as you go and you look across various NEIs is for that particular sector or subset of the emissions, has there been a methodological shift? So for example, on the left, what we have is NOx emissions nationally, and we have it broken up by kind of large sectors. And so for example, the green area, this is the light green area is the on-road sector. And you can see there's this kind of spike around 2002. But what we did here, and if you look at the actual NEI, you can see something slightly different, is we reanalyze our emissions using a consistent model, the MOVES model, back to 2002. So in this case, 2002 to the present, or through, I think, 2012 was this analysis, has a consistent model, but then there's a methodological shift before that. So if you're doing some long-term trends, thinking about those methodological shifts is important to try and say, like, well, what's happening in that inventory? Or should we go back and try and think about reanalyzing those historical inventories? On the right is something else from our trends analysis group, which is looking at kind of more spatially how the trends in NOx is shifting. So the left arrow is looking at the trend between 2008 and 2011. And so red indicates increase, green indicates decrease. And the right arrow in each state is the longer-term trend, looking at 2002 to 2013. And so you can see that in general, all the states on the long term are dropping, but there has been some recent increases in particular states, and kind of unpacking those become more and more interesting, and you can kind of see that in the trends analysis. Another analysis that is, very interesting for both health effects and for climate is black carbon, and so this is some work that's being done using the 2011 inventory that's just come out. And if you look at that, you can see that the majority of the black carbon emissions in the U.S. are coming from fires, something we've been talking a lot here, and also from the mobile sector, on-road and non-road sector. That's kind of the left chart. And then if you look at the right, we break those down into more fine slices. And you can see that, for example, in the mobile sector, it's the diesel that's really driving that. And that's what's expected. But, as we can kind of see regulatory shifts, you can imagine certain parts of these sectors dropping down. So, for example, if there's a regulation that it hits, the diesel trucks, the long-haul trucks, you would expect that percentage to start to drop as we start to look towards future scenarios. Okay. So the part of the emissions that I really work on is the emissions modeling, which is basically the process of taking these inventories and various ancillary data sets and trying to develop them into a form that is appropriate for doing air quality modeling. And also taking those and projecting them into the future. So this is kind of like a high-level overview of what that means. We start with inventories, which typically are annual, though sometimes we have monthly and even daily emissions. And we go through kind of three processes. The first process is temporalization. So this takes the annual emissions and breaks them down to ultimately hours. There's speciation. So for example, we use the speciate database, database in EPA and some other sources to kind of think about how do we take VOC and speciate into its various components that are mechanism specific for the model, whether it's CMAQ or GeoSChem or CAMEX. And then finally, there's spatial gridding. A lot of our inventories are area that are kind of important, and we have to take those area emissions that are owned by county and break them down into grid cells. And the finer our grid cells, the more and more important that spatial gridding is. So for example, here in the lower plot, we have a new spatial surrogate for shipping lanes in the Great Lakes. So if you look at the commercial marine vehicles that are going through the Great Lakes, where are you going to put those emissions? Well, those are actually going down shipping lanes. So that all this stuff kind of gets put together in a kind of conglomeration, and what we get is, voila, a pretty picture. And that pretty picture is kind of gridded, hourly, speciated emissions, which then would feed one of our regional air quality models typically. So to get a little more into the details, so one of the kind of key components, and I think one of the components that there could be some real communication and work between our communities is temporalization. This is really the distribution of emissions across time. And typically we're talking about going from annual to monthly to daily and then to hourly. And so, for example, we've started to develop some more sophisticated temporalization techniques for very particular sectors. Some of them are based on meteorological inputs. So we can basically merge our gridded hourly meteorology data sets with our inventories to kind of get the consistency between them. So for example, for residential wood combustion, we have a temporalization that aligns daily minimum temperature to the emissions. So we can kind of distribute those emissions to those cold days where things like stoves and fireplaces are going to be typically used. And so you can see that in the colder months, winter, and the fall and early spring, you're getting most of the emissions, then they drop off in the summer. Similarly, for ammonia from livestock, there's been some work from Jesse Bash in our research division, which is kind of related the ammonia emissions from these kind of CAFOs, large livestock areas, to combination of temperature, wind, and kind of aerodynamic resistance of the area. And so those really distribute the emissions from a monthly estimate down to the hour. So you can see here is our previous in blue, see basically a plateau for each month. That's how we would have previously temporalized it. And now we're taking those monthly emissions and actually using that meteorological field, which can be very, finely resolved, and getting a large amount of variability across time. So that's one component. Second component is spatial gridding. Again, this is the distribution of emissions, which typically are at the county level, but sometimes even more coarse, down to the grid cell. And as we get to finer and finer grid cells, this becomes more and more important. So there's been a lot of discussion of oil and gas. We've spent a lot of time in 2011 improving both the inventory and the spatial gridding of that inventory. And so here's an example of a data set that we used to really improve the spatial surrogates for the Marcellus Shale area. Another area that there's a lot of interest in the EPA is commercial marine vehicles, and we've tried to improve the spatial gridding in, for example, the Gulf Coast, where there's a lot of movement in and out of the various ports there. So just to kind of give you a sense of the regulatory uses of this 2011 platform. So the 2011 platform really is a base year, 2011, and a projection year. We've done a 2018 projection. We've actually also done a 2025 projection into the future. And this is primarily based on the NEI, as we said, but it's also gone through a comment period and it's continuing to go through a comment period from various states and some of the people in this room. We're using that to continuously improve those emissions. And this is the basis for a bunch of regulatory and other types of analysis work that we do. So, for example, transport of pollution across state boundaries, looking at health risks from toxics, in other words, NEDA, looking at the new criteria pollutant standards, the update to the Ozone Max proposal that's going to be coming out, and looking at co-benefits. So, for example, the greenhouse gas 111D announcement that came out just a little bit ago. This type of work feeds into thinking about, well, what are the health benefits for that? So this is a slide that, again, kind of tees up some of the discussion. So what are the challenges and potential kind of, synergies between some of the top-down and the bottom-up emissions? I think the big challenge, and I think a lot of you know this, which is we think of the emissions very detailed in terms of sources. We have thousands of kind of process codes or SCCs that define the sources. These get aggregate up to 60 EIS sectors, 19 modeling sectors. So we really think about these in a very, very detailed way. How do we align that with some of the top-down perspectives, which are looking at it kind of more globally in terms of sources, not in terms of spatial? And then aligning the spatial and temporal aspects of some of the top-down analyses with bottom-up. And I'm kind of proposing kind of some short-term goals and long-term goals, and some of these stuff is, I think you guys are already moving forward. I think that an obvious area of synergy is improvements to the temporalization, improvements to the kind of spatial gridding aspect of this that I was talking about, and kind of thinking about how your interannual trends and our interannual trends align to each other. Are we getting kind of good agreement or differences, and why? Long-term goals, and I think these are some of the more interesting, is thinking about improving these international emissions. We have problems even getting Canadian and Mexican emissions that are up to date. If we can use some of your work to improve just that, would be wonderful. And then, of course, the global emissions, thinking about long-range transport. Identifying necessary under or overrepresented emission sources. I saw some work earlier about thinking about some of the sources in India, all that type of stuff. Maybe some of that stuff can be utilized in the U.S. Thinking about dynamic updates to inventories for operational forecasting. This is actually something that I was talking to Daniel Tong out of the NOAA forecasting group. And that might be something really interesting if you're thinking about doing forecasting. We have a new source that's kind of coming online, or there's something that's new that we kind of lay into the forecasting that can improve that forecasting system. And then, as I said, it's a 3-year cycle. Well, there's those 2 years in between that we're often very interested in. How can we think about kind of estimating what's happening in between those 3 years? For some sources, we have a very good idea. For example, power sector, we have monitoring systems that actually do it. But for lots of other sources, we're just like, keep it flat, because we don't have anything better to say. So these are some kind of ideas we can talk about a little bit.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, very nice job teeing up for the discussion. One question, Brad.
Yeah.
So you touched briefly on the speciation part of it.
Yeah.
Also just from a different modeling platform, but there's also just, for a given, and I'm thinking particularly for oil and gas, the VOC speciation is kind of applied across all platforms, but there's probably actually quite a bit of variety in the emissions. How is that? What's that on certain?
So when you say there's variety in how you would speciate within that sector, is that what you're asking?
Yes.
Yeah. So that's a great question. Oil and gas is, of course, really high on our perspective. For some regions, specifically that western region, we actually have basin-specific speciation. And that's been done based on some really good work out of Tom Moore's group, that they've actually gone out and they've done some surveys and they've gotten a good sense of what the emission characteristics are, so they can actually speciate across it. Unfortunately, for the rest of the country, we don't. And so we use kind of national speciation. So if you're in Marcellus Shale or you're in another basin, you're getting the exact same speciation profile. And we're really interested in trying to take some of our profiles, and it's not just for oil and gas. The same question is for residential wood. Why would you speciate wood that's burned in western U.S. as the same as you do in the eastern U.S.? We are doing that at the moment, but that's actually something that we can definitely improve, and we would love help kind of working to improving that, because there is variation in the characteristics of those emission sources, so we should try and take advantage of those spatially.
Again, a great transition point. Thank you very much. We have, with the oil and gas comment just made, we have the next speaker coming up, Kathy Felice from API.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon. In light of all the ongoing research around oil and gas emissions, I wanted to touch upon some of the key operating characteristics of the sector that need to be considered in emission study design. So, good segue from the last presentation. Here we go. So in the last 3 years, there have been over 100, maybe 200 studies focused on oil and gas emissions. Now, some of them are addressing criteria, pollutants, and HAPs. Many more are focused on methane emissions. And a few of those studies, along with data that's developed from EPA's Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program, have improved our understanding of the sector emissions. But many other studies have just raised more questions. In fact, I think it's almost a requirement when you read a journal article and you get down to the conclusion section, the last statement will be, and more studies needed. Yeah. So the challenge for researchers that are measuring atmospheric concentrations, say, of methane, and then estimating emission fluxes, is accounting for some of these operating characteristics. And that's also the same challenge if you're developing a bottoms-up inventory, like the 2011 NEI inventory for oil and gas, and Alex just mentioned some of the issues there. So what are some of the industry characteristics that are of concern? So the composition of hydrocarbons in the reservoir is a key determinant of VOC and methane emissions. Of course, that's aside from considering any control measures. So compositions are widely variable, anything from pure methane from a coal bed methane well all the way to a heavy crude, a tarry crude. So there is no mean gas composition. And the hydrocarbon composition also drives what equipment and processing might be necessary on the site, and again, there's some specific emissions associated with the types of equipment. So for a gas well, you're going to have two phases, gas and liquid hydrocarbons, which people refer to as condensate. And on a particular well site, you might be tapped into more than one reservoir, so you're going to have different compositions because of the different reservoir. And what's also important is for the various types of emission sources on the well pad, you're going to have different speciations. So here's an example gas well pad. This is not typical. There is no typical, many different types of well configurations, but you'll see up in the top you'll have some well heads. Your multi-phase flow is going to go to a separator. You'll separate out the water and the condensate. Your wet gas will come off the top of the separator, and you may dry that on site with a glycol dehydrator skid or not, and then it will go into a sales line. So the speciation profiles of these various sources will be different. So your produced gas or raw gas is going to have a different composition than the flash gas that's coming off of your condensate tanks, which is going to have a different profile than the dehydrator vent emissions, which is going to be different from the sales gas. So here's an example from a particular well site. So here's a profile for the produced gas, that's the raw gas on the site, versus the composition of the flash gas coming from the condensate tanks. So you might, the produced gas, you might see that from pneumatic devices that are used, or if you're venting from the well for some reason. And you can see how very different the profile is depending upon the source on the well site. And of course for dehydrators, it will be different as well. So compositions are not consistent by formation type. This is some survey data, random industry survey. I've put a few formation types on here, and within those regions you can see the variability in the methane, ethane, CO2 emissions. It's not a formation average because it's a random survey, but you can see, you know, there's quite a bit of data there. Each data point is a gas composition analysis that was done. And you won't have consistent compositions within a single basin. So here are some data for shale gas in the Appalachian Basin. I sorted these by methane content. It's hard to see from here, but it's ranging from 61% to 90%. And although I haven't indicated it on here. I know there's some researchers that are trying to use a methane to ethane or methane to propane ratio to try to project or to quantify oil and gas emissions, but certainly those ratios aren't constant. They're quite variable in a given area. Also talked about the fact that the gas composition drives equipment and processing. These are some charts from the RAP 2008 inventory work for 2 different basins. And so you can see the VOC contributions in the southwest Wyoming basin, or the biggest contributor is condensate tanks, whereas in the Powder River basin, which has a lot of coal bed methane, your biggest VOC contributor is compressor engines. So another complication in trying to design your study. Another industry characteristic is temporal variability. And you know, not only are the frequency of these types of emissions going to be different, but the magnitude will be different, and for intermittent emissions, the duration of that period will vary. So there are what I call episodic emissions, emissions that aren't associated with the normal day-to-day operation of the well, and those would include engine emissions from drilling and well completion, so part of those fracking emissions that are mentioned. Or you might have a well blowdown because you've done some maintenance. Some of the source types on the well pad are going to emit continuously, things like glycol dehydrators, equipment fugitives, continuous bleed pneumatic devices, or continuous fired heaters and boilers. And then probably the trickiest category are some sources that emit on a periodic or intermittent basis. If we look at well venting for liquids unloading, this has a wide frequency range, so you might have a well that's venting once a day, once a week, once a year, or maybe it never vents. And so if you're out there on a short-term sample, doing short-term sampling, and you're driving by, well, if it's a well that vents once a year and you happen to be driving by and you try to extrapolate those emissions to an annual basis, well, that would be an issue. On the other hand, if a well vents once a week and you're out there for 3 days and you don't see that and you assume it doesn't happen very frequently, well, that will also give you some error in your estimation. Other types of intermittent emissions, truck loading, the tank flashing emissions, pneumatic pumps, and intermittent vent controllers. There's also differences based on time of day, so truck loading normally occurs in the daylight hours. For fired sources, heater treaters, you're likely to see more emissions at night or in the wintertime for those sources. One last characteristic I want to mention is production decline. All wells experience production decline. This is a chart for a well in the western U.S. But you can see that the production drops off very rapidly in the well life. So if you're out there studying emissions and you're looking at new wells where you're going to have a lot higher emissions because you have a lot higher production, you need to be careful about projecting emissions on those data. You need to be aware of where you are in the life cycle of the well. And just wanted to mention, the accounting for other non-oil and gas sources and their contribution. This is a chart of greenhouse gas emissions. This is from the EPA 2012 National Emissions Inventory. And you can see that non-oil and gas sources, which are often co-located in production areas, can be a significant portion of U.S. methane emissions. And there have been some researchers that try to assign, that are doing a top-down inventory and then comparing it to a bottoms-up, and they've got a gap and they want to assign all of the error or all of the difference to the oil and gas sector. And I think Kevin showed that, well, sometimes that may not be right. Be careful about assuming that all the other sectors' emissions are appropriately estimated and all the errors coming from the oil and gas side. And also wanted to mention that methane from natural geologic seeps can be significant. There have been some studies in the literature that estimate that methane from such seeps could account for anywhere between 7 and 14% of global methane emissions. So if a study is occurring in an area that's known to have a lot of natural seeps, then it will be important that those be quantified as part of your baseline emissions. So in summary, some of the considerations for a study around oil and gas emissions, many of the sources are not steady state. They're going to vary with hydrocarbon composition, site-specific geological conditions, and operational practices. And so, given the uncertainty in flux models and the variation in emissions, there's potential to have high uncertainties, thus the need for careful study design. Need to be sure we're properly accounting for emissions that are coming from the non-oil and gas sector. And we think that, working with industry can help. It can help when you're setting out a sampling program so that you can capture the full range of emissions. Even if a study's been completed and folks are trying to analyze their data, it might be useful to talk to operators in the area to get more information about what may or may not be happening. I read a paper a couple of months ago, and this was a flyover that was somewhere in the Marcellus, and they flew over some drilling operations. And in the paper, they're hypothesizing about, is what we see from underbalanced drilling, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm thinking, it's like, I wonder if they talk to the drilling operators about this. It just seems strange to me that, so I wondered if there was communication. So discussion is good. And I'll note lastly that, there are some studies that are getting started that they're trying to tackle some of these sticky issues. There's a big study that's just getting started in the West that's going to try to look at trying to reconcile the differences between top-down and bottom-up studies, top-down and bottom-up inventories. And that particular study also has a goal of trying to come up, and this study's for methane, by the way, come up with a goal, developing a protocol that can be used for people that are using aircraft flyovers or towers or mobile surveys to study methane emissions so that there's some consistency. And they also have, one of their other goals is to develop more bottom-up inventory tools and probability distributions that can be used to better define the uncertainties around bottoms-up inventories. And last slide, I'll just mention some API efforts that are under consideration. We're considering a workshop that's focused on major methane-producing industries, which includes our sector as well as others, and that would include exploration of how to fill research gaps. Probably something where we'd be looking to partner with an academic institution or a government agency to sponsor that, to put on that workshop. Another project is developing a guidance manual on methane emission sources. This is for the producing, gathering, and processing sectors with guidance on minimization and control of methane emissions. And that is it.
Thank you very much. Questions? Yeah.
I heard that there was more and more ethane recovery going on now, that ethane is becoming more and more valuable. Does that affect our ability to use it as a tracer of natural gas?
I don't know.
Okay, well, thank you for very nice comments, and I'm sure we'll have some more questions for the panel here, and for the invitation to work with the industry. Okay, next talk is going to be by Bianca. Is going to be talking about perspectives on from operational air quality predictions status and research needs.
If you want, you can just use the second
Well, good afternoon. So I'm going to give a little bit of an update on the air quality prediction status at NOAA and our research needs. So, okay. So if some of you are not familiar with what we do, we have operational predictions of ozone, smoke, and dust over the continuous 48 states, and we also have smoke and ozone predictions over Alaska and Hawaii. We're currently doing testing of improvements to the ozone predictions, and we are developmentally testing predictions of PM2.5. The purpose of all this is to provide general public with the estimates of the predicted air concentrations of air quality pollutants, and also provide basis for state and local air quality forecasters to issue their AQI forecasts for next day. So the way that is done is we have an operational model running at NOAA NSEP, and for ozone we are using the CMAQ model. For smoke and dust we are using a HEISWIT model. The emissions inventories are used for the ozone predictions, and for smoke and dust we are using, for smoke we use the HMS detections of wildfires, and for dust we use climatology based on MODIS, together with the estimates of wind that picks up those dust emissions. The predictions are produced twice daily, going out for 48 hours. They are distributed. Oops, sorry about that. They're distributed on this website, airquality.weather.gov. That's where you can get these maps for CONUS, Alaska, Hawaii. Also zoom into your regions, and then they're verified. All those predictions are verified routinely every day. And we also then collect the feedback from state and local air quality forecasters and from general public routinely. This is an example of our ozone predictions, as I said, for 3 domains, predicting one hourly average ozone and 8 hourly average ozone here. And the main metric that we use to evaluate our ozone predictions is how well we're predicting whether we are above or below code orange threshold, which is 75 parts per billion for daily maximum of 8 hourly average ozone. And typically we do pretty well. Last summer was very cold, very few episodes of ozone exceedances in the east. But in the model, one thing that we've had, say in 2010, we have used some of older emissions inventories, and using the CB05 version of CMAQ, we have seen very substantial overestimate of ozone in the summertime especially. So observations here are shown in black, and our model predictions are shown in red. This is the average over contiguous 48 states. At the same time, NO2 was also too high in the model. So one of the things that controls, of course, what you have in the model for ozone and NO2 are the emissions. What we are currently doing is we have updated the emissions, which is still mostly based on NEI 2005, but we have updated the mobile emissions using projections for 2012, and the non-road emissions from area sources also are updated using that 2012 projection. We routinely update our point sources using actual CM data that have about 2 years old by the time we use them. So for 2014, we're using 2012 actual measurements, plus some projections from DOE for 2014. So those are captured pretty well, the point sources. But all these other things, mobile sources and area sources, there is quite a bit of a lag. And that's something that we have done something to address that, but more needs to be done. So when we did this adjustment using 2012 projections, so what's shown here are comparisons of measurements in colors. The OMI NO2 is shown, OMI NO2 is shown in red, and AQS, so those are surface monitor measurements, is shown in green. What we have used based on 2005 NEI is shown in this dashed black line on the top. Through 2011, we haven't really changed those. And then for 2012, we started using those projections for mobile emissions. That dropped NOx emissions in the model by quite a bit. And here you see a comparison for 2 cities, Atlanta and Philadelphia. And you see that we have decreased to something that is comparable to what's actually observed, but it's not quite there. It's still not going far enough. So there's more about this on a poster outside. This is mostly work by Daniel Tong. And when we reduce those emissions, we receive feedback from air quality forecasters, especially from the eastern U.S., where the reductions were the biggest. It's like, great. So because for years they were telling us, well, we're over-predicting, look at the emissions, but then when we updated them, quite happy. But as I said, there's still room to improve on that. Another thing that we do is we predict smoke dispersion from wildfires. That is based on a high-split model. And here's just a brief description of how that's done, and you can look at that more, I guess, when the presentations are posted online. One thing about the smoke prediction that was an issue for us until about last year is that we tended to significantly overestimate smoke concentrations near the source, near fires. And one of the changes we did last year is that we have allowed the smoke plume to rise above the planetary boundary layer. And that has then reduced some of these smoke concentrations near the sources. And here you can see an example from rim fire predictions as they started impacting Reno, Nevada, as the plume was shifting eastward. We started impacting that. That is something we are seeing in our predictions, which is shown here in black. So the concentrations are first very low, then they impact Reno, and they get a little lower. These are the actual measurements of PM2.5 in Reno in colors. So you can see that the timing is agreeing, but actually our concentration is now underestimated. So at least we are not consistently overestimating now. So that's where that stands. We also are predicting the dust dispersion from dust storms, also using high-split model. And it's the sources are based on the modesty group climatology, and then they use the actual wind, real-time wind prediction and soil moisture to estimate the emission from those potential sources. Another piece that I would like to focus on here is the testing of PM. We have been doing that for some years now. And here's an example on the left of our test prediction showing elevated PM in the northeast. I think that was last winter in December. You see this is the actual observed AQI on that day. And what you typically see is that we tend to overestimate PM concentrations. And looking here at the monthly bias of PM by region, so each one of these colors corresponds to one of the regions in the U.S. We typically see overestimated PM in wintertime and underestimated in summer, which has, those biases have decreased a bit in recent years, but still substantial biases remain. One thing you should note is that in these predictions, in the recent years from about 2011, 2012 till now, we are not including any forest fire emissions, and which we are planning to start including this summer, and that might help resolve some of this under-distribution this summer. But that is not Weather Service or NOAA related issue, that the seasonal biases. This is from evaluation of CMAQ versions 4.6 and 4.7, both are shown here. So also they have seen this wintertime in January overestimation of PM and underestimation of PM in the summertime. We're also looking at the speciation. The wintertime overestimation tends to be dominated by this component which they call other. Part of that are soil emissions, dust that get lumped into this, and summertime it's the carbon that's not necessary. We found similar things in our evaluation of CMAQ. So one thing that we're trying to do short term to try to provide better prediction of PM 2.5 is try to use surface data to correct the biases in the model. Ezra Group has been, Ezra Group has been working on using different ways of estimating and subtracting bias from the predictions. And they have tested several approaches here, and we are currently working on trying to transition this approach, which combines Kalman filter estimates and then analog forecast technique that follows that to reduce the bias in our predictions. And when they look at that, they find that the systematic error is almost gone when they use that approach, and also the random part of the error as well. So that's something we're trying to get running at the Weather Service. We are also working at the same time trying to improve the model from the first principles, because yeah, data is great, let's try to use them, but we really want to be able to improve the understanding and the model that we're using here. So some of this is improving the emissions, some of this is, say, as I said, there's overestimation of that PM other, a lot of it being soil emissions, dust emissions. So one of the things we're doing is modulating the emissions of dust and soil in the wintertime when there's actual snow and ice covered. There shouldn't be any soil emitted there. So that's something we're putting in here, putting in the real-time fire emissions as well. So that's something we're testing right now, and we're hoping to make that actually operational at the end of this year in September. Another thing that we are trying to do is connecting our regional predictions with what is being done in the global model, which is predicting now the dust on a global scale, trying to use that to provide lateral boundary conditions for our CMAQ modeling. And this is an example of when that was when global model was used to provide lateral boundary conditions that were representing the advection of the Saharan dust into southern U.S. Here shown in Miami. The impact, the green thing had clean boundary conditions. The red thing had actually the lateral boundary conditions from the global model, and quite well representing the observed PM 2.5 in black. So these are the operational predictions that we have now. We have ozone, we have PM, we also have dust, and that is available at this website, airqualityweather.gov. Here is where you can find more information about the program on this website. And as I said, we have operational ozone, smoke, and dust predictions. We're testing improvements to ozone. And there's also aerosol prediction being tested in that same system. We would like to transition this system into operations. So even though PM predictions will not be operational, they should be routinely available daily, so more people will be able to look at them and evaluate them and hopefully improve over time from that as well. We are looking at including lateral boundary conditions, and for smoke predictions, we're trying to look at the higher resolution of meteorology data for that. But the main thing I would like to leave this group with is our main research needs are improving the emissions for the predictions, because currently what we are basing our emissions on is on the NEI, and at best that information has a lag of 4 to 6 years. We are using CM data, which have about 2-year lag, but we're really looking for how to improve the emissions for prediction. This is not for safe monitoring and anything like that. For prediction purposes, how to have the best emissions that will reflect the recent trends. As that's really our input for predictions. It's our force. And the other thing is really PM modeling. Ozone modeling, of course, is not perfect, but PM has bigger issues, and that's really what we need improvements in treatment of chemistry, meteorology challenges, lateral boundary conditions. That's something we're going to be working on including. And then use of data for bias correction, data assimilation, whichever way we can.
Thank you. Okay, that's the team. Okay.
Yes.
Time for a question? Yes.
So why is there such a long time lead? Because obviously we've gone past the 2005 you guys have communities. What's it like the process for achieving that? Why they take so long?
One thing that has stopped us from using 2008 NEI, for example, is the change to mobile emission processing. As you have shown, there is quite a bit of change in the emissions from mobile sector there, and that increase of emissions would really have been would have really degraded our predictions. So we were looking at other ways to reflect that information. So we would like to transition to 2011 NEI, but I think that's still being evaluated and commented. So usually we
It's always a question.
That's an important point. So maybe we can pick that up and have that discussion over the next time that we have together. Okay, so the last of the, thank you very much. So the last of the presentations before the panel is going to be by Dan Greenbaum from HEI. So we'll hear again of needs and challenges from another perspective.
I'll open it up.
Okay. He's on his screen.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
Page up.
Well, I'm in great trouble here. I'm the last speaker of the day on a very long day, and I am probably the least qualified person here to talk about remote sensing and what you all are doing. But I'm going to venture in anyway. I will tell you that having heard all of the talks, or many of the talks, and knowing I'm here at the end of the day, I have no word slides. I have only 5 slides. I am going to share with you some ideas about areas that I think can be, and they were already talked about a little bit, where this set of tools that you are all working to develop can really help as they develop with air quality management. And although my talk topic was the U.S., I'm going to talk a little bit about other parts of the world as well. I come to this both being the head of the Health Effects Institute, so we actually got mentioned earlier, the Krusky report, but also having co-chaired a committee of the National Research Council about a decade ago that looked at air quality management in the United States. The good news is that we actually did talk about satellite remote sensing 10 years ago as something that showed great promise and talked about some of the work that was going on then. And you've gone a long way since then. But with that, I'm going to now I'm going to see if I know how to do this. Can I just hit F5? No. Oh, no. Do you want? Yeah, bring it up. So, sorry. So I'm going to talk about three things where I think this is being used and where it can be used, but where we have to do good work to make it useful for air quality management. So this is a study which actually was published a few years ago. Aaron van Donkelaar and Randall Martin were involved in it, taking a large, very large cohort in Canada, 2.1 million people, which is much larger than the American Cancer Society cohort, at least the part that's been used for air quality, and applying satellite remote sensing measurements to estimate their PM exposure. And one of the core things when you're doing a health study is what kind of statistical power you have, particularly at the low end of the exposure scale. And this study appeared to have quite strong statistical power, 2.1 million people in a wide range of areas with some very low exposure levels. And there were some limitations. The study was a census data that didn't have, for example, information on smoking for everybody in the population, other things that are important. But importantly, it found in this one study very strong effects at very low levels. So the Krusky study that was referred to earlier, let me make sure I'm pointed correctly here. There we go. The Krusky study, the averages are about here, 14 or 15 for the ambient PM2.5. That's measurements that were used to get to that. The current U.S. standard, which was finalized in December 2012, is 12 micrograms per cubic meter. This study found effects going down as low as 8 and lower. Now, I will tell you that the statisticians on our research committee looked at this chart and said they had never seen a set of 95% confidence intervals that were that close to the line. So there are lots of questions one could ask. But the implications of this, if it's true and if it shows up in other places, are amazing if you think about where we're trying to target reductions now. So remember, 12 is where EPA has set this new standard. Should it be lower? That's a good question. And we at HAI, and I'm going to mention this so people are aware of this, are actively engaged in a research planning process as we speak to think about issuing a request for preliminary applications later this year, where we would expect to be able to look at populations of people and exposure estimates, which could come from a variety of things, but satellites might be one part of that, that actually could, where we could test this and see how well is this done, how good are these studies, are the statistics done right, all of the right things. But this is a very important area because obviously every time we talk about whether we should be taking the standard to a lower level, that has incredible air quality management implications. It affects the air quality now system. It affects a lot of other things. So that's one thing one of the points I wanted to make. The second one, and I'm going to, you've talked about this a lot in the U.S. context. I'm going to tell you some good news and some daunting news. We've been working in China for the last 10 or 12 years. I was there a couple of weeks ago, and the good news is that every city in China is being required to do a source apportionment by the end of this year. So they can go about deciding how to control pollution and start to reduce it. The daunting news is that every city in China is being required to do a source apportionment by the end of this year. because as the discussion here about from our colleague from EPA was about the emissions inventory, we've been working on this for a long time, and we do a pretty good job on emission inventories, but there are always questions and uncertainties and various other things. And the Chinese data set is probably, David is as familiar with this as anybody, but it's probably a little more challenging. And I bring this up because you're all familiar, I assume, with this effort that was done using a combination of satellite measurements, models, and validation against ground measurements to estimate the exposure. This was the Chinese piece of it worldwide as part of the global burden of disease estimate, which we were involved in. But increasingly, the desire is to say, well, what are the implications of this for sources? Is there a burden relating to certain sources? In fact, there have now been two analyses, I'd say one analysis published by the World Bank looking at traffic sources and using the global burden of disease approach. But there are limitations on that. They're limited to what we know about the source emissions inventory that goes into the models that are used in this. There are limitations in other ways. And I understand, from my limited understanding of remote sensing, that the data sets that are available to understand exactly what, even the pollutant measurements that are available from remote sensing, won't necessarily give you fine-grained analysis of individual sources. The discussion today about oil and gas being one example of that. But still, the challenge of trying to come up with better and better tools to use a combination of what we have used historically and some form of remote sensing or other tools to do a better job on source apportionment. This is the linchpin of doing quality air quality measurement. And I meant what I said. The good news in China is they are actually trying to do source apportionment studies in every city. Because when I first started going there, everybody told me that the vehicles were 75% of the issue in Beijing. Well, they are a big part of the issue, but they are not 75% of the issue, and there's a lot of other sources there as well. So source apportionment is really key, and I think you all understand that. The last thing I want to talk about, this is not satellite measurements. This was actually sulfate deposition, red sulfate deposition measurements. The issue of accountability research, or what we sometimes call health outcomes research, is really increasingly critical in the world of air quality management. As we move towards tighter and tighter standards, as we move towards tougher and tougher decisions, the ability to say, did the things we did before work? Did they have the intended effect? Did they improve air quality first? And then secondly, did they have a health benefit? Or in this case, an ecological benefit? These are important questions. And let me give you an example. Some of you are probably familiar. You've probably heard it. It's almost kind of an urban myth now. There was a study done in the early 2000s of the Atlanta Olympics. There was a study done that said, well, during the Olympics, they put in traffic measures to reduce traffic. Ozone went down. Asthma hospitalizations for kids went down. So we saw this very nice cause and effect relationship. Traffic controls, ozone down, fewer asthma. So a number of people raised questions about that analysis at the time. We funded a much more detailed analysis of that a few years ago by Jennifer Peel of Colorado State. A couple things. First of all, she pointed out that actually daily traffic didn't go down. It went down during the rush hour, but the total travel counts were the same. And that's partly because when you looked at what the traffic controls were, they were basically signboards telling people use transit. There were no traffic control. The second thing she did, and this is where you guys could come in, is they looked throughout the Southeast region at ozone levels during that period of time. And they went down everywhere, including lots of places that wouldn't have been influenced by Atlanta. We didn't go into fine-grained modeling, but it was cloudy. You know, I mean, the atmospheric conditions. The third thing she did, which is not on your plate, is that we had heard this before, there actually was a seasonal pattern at the end of school where the number of kids going into the hospital for asthma hospitalizations went down. So when she controlled for that in the analysis, you really couldn't see any benefit. which doesn't say they shouldn't take the action in the first place. In fact, they probably should have done a much better job on the action in the first place. But this kind of accountability stuff is going to get asked more and more and more, and I think it's really important. Those first two questions, the air quality question, are the kinds of things that the people around this room could really help with. And over time, I think the ability to kind of track these things in a fairly consistent way could be really very, very valuable. So that's the third point I wanted to make, this role of remote sensing and exposure assessment. The role potentially in source apportionment, and can that be amplified? And this third one, which may be the most important, which is its role in accountability assessments, in health outcomes assessments. And I look forward to the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. Question, comments? I know we're getting ready. We're going to put these 6, 7 chairs up here in just a moment here, but while we're doing that, questions, Daniel?
I have a question for Dan. This is the Canadian study is fascinating. It seems pretty clear to me for PM or for ozone that there doesn't seem to be a threshold, right? So we're kind of fooling ourselves, it seems, in terms of setting air quality standards, because unless we set an air quality standard to 0, people will still die. And so at some point, we're going to have to do some cost-benefit analysis. You've, I'm sure, a lot about this.
Yeah, yeah. Well, actually, the Supreme Court thought about the cost-benefit analysis back in after the last PM review, where they would talk from there's this odd thing in which the Clean Air Act has been really clear. You're not supposed to use cost, so that should be permitted. But two things I would say. First of all, I think most statisticians, until they saw things like this Canadian study, would say we have not had the statistical power to know whether there could be a threshold. And our statisticians, when they reviewed studies, have said there have been times when we've said the results are lower. For example, the daily standard was 2.5. When it was 65, our statisticians said, well, it's definitely lower than that. But it doesn't mean there's no threshold. We just don't have the power down below. And so just on a statistical point of view, I don't think you could say it. It doesn't mean that the 12 is necessarily wrong that EPA went to. That's one. I think the second one is that, and I'm fond of calling that decision that the administrator has to make. And this is what I use when I do congressional testimony, a public health policy judgment. Because it's basic, it's not a purely scientific decision. Remember, it's protect the public health with an adequate margin of safety. And at some point, a judgment about, well, do the confidence intervals get too wide so I don't feel I can go down and know that there's an effect below. And different administrators have made different calls on that. The last piece, ultimately, cost-benefit analysis may be the way to make that judgment. I think another key question, obviously, is the one we had earlier on ozone we talked about, which is what's the background level? What's showing up before we even add sort of human sources to this? And it's hard to imagine setting a standard down to those levels. But I think you're right. We get down to a level where the questions get much harder, and the control strategy.
Should we be talking about PM2.5 or should we be talking about
Have I got some studies for you? No, a couple things. We actually did publish a review of the ultrafine literature, building in part on EPA's own review of it. About a year ago, we published that. And there's evidence of effects of the ultrafines. There is not very strong evidence that they are somehow the thing that is causing effects, number one. And number two, almost all of the evidence for ultrafines is short-term effects, acute effects. But whenever we hear an estimate of impacts for air, it's the long term. And it's not clear that the mechanisms are the same. And we have no very good measurements long-term for exposure to it's much harder to estimate exposure to ultrafines. So that's one. The second, I will mention, we published 2 comprehensive studies last fall, our National Particle Component Toxicity Initiative. They're available on our website, NPAC. And those were efforts in toxicology and epidemiology to look across the entire range of sources and components of PM and to see whether there was some clear signal that some of them are more toxic than others. And our conclusion, you know, science is never, it's always messy. You guys all know that, but was that it wasn't possible right now to take a winner or a loser there to say if we can eliminate one thing. There was some evidence of some stronger effects, but it was, well, we weren't ready to do that. So I mean, I welcome people looking at that. I will say that your colleagues who actually write the standards were very pleased to hear that last one because it meant that their assumption had been fine, but that wasn't where we started. But that's the hypothesis had been there would be specific toxicity.
Okay, well, thank
Sorry.
all the speakers. I think we're ready to transition.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, this has been, we're running a little bit late, but that comes from having a lot of good discussion talks. So if I could invite all the speakers for this air quality management session to come grab a seat and sit in front of a room, and we can have an abbreviated panel discussion. I think here the idea is to follow up on the discussion we've had for our individual talks with questions on what is it that earth science could contribute to air quality management in light of the presentation that we've heard. And okay, I'll spread it up. And certainly, yes, you know, Pat told us how background also has been kind of a signature activity under APEX. And my question to Pat, and maybe to others on the panel, is why do we care about background ozone? All the ozone is the same, and we used to talk about policy relevant background ozone, but there's no policy relevance anymore, so should we think about background ozone as a useful concept?
I think it is a useful concept still.